And a big part of the recovery process is helping them to get really down to the nitty-gritty of, well, I can help you work through what you've been doing, but if you don't have a clear sense of what you want to be doing or what you want to become as a sexual partner, as a companion, as an intimate mate, then we're just running away from something but not towards anything else. If we paid attention to what Clay was talking about in his talk this morning, he really touched on some really cool things about changing the conversation, where we need to be pursuing an avenue of, where they were talking about pursuing love rather than just degrading pornography. If you just have a bad label for pornography, just talk about how bad pornography is, we're not pursuing anything. We've got to pursue something that's healthy and focused and something that's desirable. And so a sexual health conversation on the front end of any recovery process is critical. And yet, it takes some time for many folks to even get the buy-in to that this is where we need to start. They just want to know, what do I need to do to stop? If all you want to do is stop, then I'm not the guy for you. If you want to change, if you want to become something healthy, then I can do something with you. This is, if for nothing else we do today, this is the soul of what we're talking about in recovery and in my talk today. The opposite of addiction is not recovery, as many people might have you think. It is actually connection. Connection with yourself, connection with a higher power, God, if you will. Individuals who've never really truly had a great intimate connection. And we're not talking about sexual intimacy. We're talking about relational, emotional intimacy. However, recovery involves risk. What's interesting is folks who struggle with a sexual addiction or pornography addiction are taking all kinds of risks. Secrets, lies, betrayal, deception. You would think that risk would be something that they are not averse to, and you'd be wrong. In fact, risk is the thing they're most scared of. When we ask them to be transparent, to be vulnerable, to be honest, to own what they're doing, to be accountable, to them, that is a risk that is terrifying because it becomes an exposing of who they are and what they've been doing. And yet, without risk, you will not achieve intimacy. If you remember back when you first started dating a guy or a girl and you got to know them pretty well and you thinking it's going pretty well and you start to lean in for that first kiss, you're taking a risk that they are either going to lean in and reciprocate or move back and give you the heave-ho, okay? There is no difference in that than in recovery. There are no guarantees of what's going to happen when you take risks. No guarantees. A clinician such as myself will never offer a guarantee of anything because there's no such thing. But what I can promise you is that if you don't take risks, you already have a path that's well-worn, that you're very familiar with, and will get you the same outcome. So this is the whole concept of recovery. In my experience, this is what I've come to understand. The opposite of addiction is connection. Recovery is the path back to it. Recovery requires risk, and risk is what engenders intimacy. A friend of mine, I don't know if she created this, but she brought the notion to me. She says, intimacy is an into me you see. Literally looking inside of me and knowing me who I am. And intimacy is not just something I share with another person, it's something I share with myself. And so we're looking to get back to connection. So, some things that you're probably very familiar with, we'll touch on them just briefly, but obviously pornography is all over in this modern digital age. However, not everybody that looks at pornography becomes addicted, okay? Just like everybody who drinks alcohol does not become an alcoholic. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean it's a benign entity. In fact, it's a very pernicious entity and has a lot of consequences, many of which people aren't even aware have occurred within them. But pornography addiction, or in other words, cyber sex addiction, because in reality, in modern day, we're not talking about old school pornography. Like as Clay mentioned earlier, we're not talking about magazines, Penthouse and Playboy. In fact, very few people actually pick up pornography magazines at all anymore. And the porn industry of the past that had certain limitations on what they could put in print does not have that same limitation in the cyber universe, okay? Cyber universe, there's all kinds of things going on. So as we talked about earlier today, pornography of today and the use of that term means something completely different than it did in days past. Often and almost always, before, during, or after the experience, there's masturbation involved. Masturbation simply just reinforces the attachment and the connection to that behavior, that consumption. What is addiction? Plain and simple. It's a sexual obsession, there's loss of control, and there's negative consequences. Don't overcomplicate it. Simplified. That is what an addiction is if you've got those components. And early life exposure, which is what most individuals are having now. Pornography is not something people are coming in contact with in their 20s and 30s. It's happening when they're 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. But however, that early exposure is a form of psychological sexual abuse. That's a pretty profound way to say it, but in fact, the exposure to the pornography is in itself the trauma. It impacts the neurology of the brain, as was already highlighted earlier today. We're becoming more and more aware that our arousal and sexual templates are being inscripted upon rather than being allowed to play themselves out. They're being distorted. So when we talk about the effects of pornography, the earlier the exposure, the more profound the impact it is. Some other aspects of it, you guys can look over some of those, but it's important to note that this addiction to pornography, cybersex, it often doesn't stay just looking at a screen. It becomes, in many ways, something that I engage in offline. Or I might engage online with another person, be they male or female or whatever they claim themselves to be. Or there's the cameras and the webcams of sharing and exchanging sexual experiences. So pornography isn't just looking at a static image, but in fact it has now gone into the realm of creating interactions online with other people, paying or promoting other people to engage in certain sex acts that you want to observe or you want to have some way of manipulating. Anything you can think of, somebody else is already promoting it and using it. So when we talk about pornography, we have to be really clear. When we're educating ourselves around it, we're not just wanting to know what have you looked at, we're wanting to know what are you doing? What are you engaging in? What are the various ways you're activating your arousal and your sexual self? Not just what are you looking at. By the way, if there's any questions along the way, don't hesitate to raise your hand. If I have an answer, I'll give it to you. If I don't, I'll tell you I don't. I won't go into too much of this, but if any of you are the spouse or partner of somebody, this probably looks really familiar. If you're dealing with any of these symptoms, it's pretty much par for the course. Gaslighting is just another way of saying crazy making. Basically making the person think one thing when another thing is actually the truth. Okay? It actually comes from an old black and white movie called Gaslighting. You can look it up and see what that context is. But the trauma of repeated infidelity, loss of trust, dealing with betrayal, all kinds of impacts for that partner. And if I don't take time as a recovering addict to pay attention to the impact on my partner and loved ones and only focus on myself, I'm missing a big part of recovery, because what did we talk about at the beginning? What is recovery? It's a pathway back to connection. And if I'm not allowing the recovery to get me back into connection with self, God, another person, then it's going to be half-hearted at best. So we have to be really clear over time, and we call it empathy development, because there's a lack of empathy in so many ways. And oftentimes it's not because I don't care what happens to you, it's I'm not thinking about what's happening to you. That's the ultimate in lack of empathy. So if we talk about a sociopath, they actually get excited about the pain that other people feel. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about somebody so disconnected from the fact that it's actually having an impact on you. And yet, when they come into recovery, they're having to come full circle and come to terms with that. And it's a very painful thing. What does that mean? It comes back to the other piece we talked about, risk. I've got to risk experiencing all the feelings and the emotions that go along with understanding what it was like for you to deal with me, to be in a relationship with me who was betraying you, and trusting that it's not going to take me out, that I can handle, that I can endure it well. There's also impact on children. If for nothing else, please look at that last one. When we're dealing with recovery, children are not a venting resource. We do not create alliances with them, and we certainly don't make them our confidants. And yet, unfortunately, that is very common. I don't trust my spouse or my partner. I got to find somebody. If I have a kid in the home, it's not because I'm intending to harm them. I'm literally not thinking, and I'm looking for a way to reduce my own anxiety and deal with my own distress. And oftentimes their betrayal trauma prompts them to say and do things that in their right mind they wouldn't say and do. They would understand in another context, this is inappropriate and unhealthy. But because of the traumatic impact, it promotes unhealthy reactions at times, oftentimes. But again, there's a whole slew of things that happen to children when their parent or parents are dealing with any form of sexual addiction or pornography addiction. In fact, that middle one there, the parents start to lose credibility and they're less available for the nurturing due to that distress. Now we're talking about a whole other generation of the family being affected by pornography, not because they're now looking at it, the kids, but because they're dealing with parents who are so disconnected from them because they're caught up in the overwhelm of the ordeal of dealing with the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, and the acting out. So the kids in and of themselves are getting a flawed template for what healthy intimacy is supposed to look like, right? So if we keep paying attention to this, intimacy and connection is being assaulted on all sides when it comes to this behavior and this struggle. So what do? The steps to stopping and healing, and usually, almost always, unfortunately, it comes after substantial consequences have already played out. Why is that? Well, because the person has been living in so much secrecy for so long that they've been holding off at bay all kinds of potential consequences that by the time they actually feel any consequence, it's not usually something small. It's usually an avalanche because they've been holding back so much that once a little bit is discovered, it starts to flood out. And in fact, in today's day and age, the notion of infidelity through pornography or in interaction with other people is currently now known as a death by 1,000 cuts, because whereas in the past you might notice maybe a little lipstick on the collar or see a receipt from somewhere, now the betrayed partner can do what? She can discover, or he can discover, a trail of texts or emails or a history on the computer that you've been engaging in. They can track and read all of the nuances of what you said to the other person, what kind of sexual interests you've been involved in that obviously you haven't shared with me in our relationship, what things you might have posted about yourself or images you posted about yourself. It's a real sad thing to watch this partner or spouse go through the torment that they put themselves through because they get oftentimes so caught up on the details of the acting out rather than doing what we call investigative questions, understanding what's driving their partner to do it. But that's human nature, what they're doing. They're not crazy or weird to do it. It's just not healthy. It's not an effective way to deal with the problem, but they get stuck in that. So when we talk about usually after substantial consequences, we do mean a lot of consequences. He or she is coming in because now there's been a discovery, there's been a partial disclosure, there's been a loss of job, there's been a kid who discovered their stash, something has happened, and now the shame is rising up, and they're now motivated to do something. But they're not necessarily motivated to change, they're just motivated to, what I need to do so that I'm not dealing with these problems. We got to be patient. So, what does recovery require? First and foremost, it requires engaging other people. The very thing I wasn't doing in the acting out is what is absolutely required in order to recover. I've got to engage other people, particularly people who have a similar experience. Either they have struggled and been in their own recovery around pornography addiction or sexual addiction of some kind. You got to have a written sexual boundary plan. We're going to talk more about what that means. And you work on that with certain people. Having a person or people with whom you are accountable. In the 12-step community, they call those sponsors. But beyond that, you still have multiple sponsors, if you will, multiple accountability peers. No less than 3 or 4, in my experience, is going to be sufficient. And always asking for help. And what is that again? That comes back to the risk. Asking for help is taking a risk that you may or may not help me, you may or may not judge me, you may or may not be able to help me. The initial priority is behavior change. If we can't get some kind of behavioral shift away from the acting out, away from the looking online, away from acting with certain people, whatever the activity is, we're going to struggle with any of the other insight-oriented processes and any of the growth and healing. So behavior change is critical, hence the sexual boundary plan, other components we'll talk a little more about. And what is your vision of sexual health? Remember we talked about that? A sexual health conversation is the first thing that I want to have with somebody. I get what you don't want to be doing. I'm not clear where you want to be yet. Because I can't assume that my vision of sexual health for you is what you want for yourself. And I'm not going to impose it upon you. But I'm certainly going to give you feedback. I'm going to be a kaleidoscope, if you will, and give you different visions of what you're thinking and what might play out as a result of that. And you certainly can't change by yourself. That insight and accountability from people outside of your own brain is critical to attack that distorted thinking that justifies and rationalizes whatever I'm doing. Okay? By the way, as it says, it's way more rewarding and enjoyable, and it's really, truly the only way it's going to happen. But be careful. In the early stages, oftentimes the men or women that come in and see me, pretty quickly they'll have some kind of symptom relief. They've stopped looking online, they've stopped hooking up with so-and-so, they've stopped interacting with whatnot, and they're not feeling any motivation to do it again. I haven't had any urges for a few weeks. This is great. I think I've got it. I've been to a few meetings, and I'm good. I'm feeling really good about it. I'm feeling really confident. And I said, that's great. I'm really excited for it. I'm glad that good thing is happening, and I'm just waiting for the honeymoon to end. Because the fact is you haven't had enough time to actually change your brain and your template in order for that to be a lasting change. But I'm glad you're feeling some measure of symptom relief because it gives you a chance to at least believe there's hope. Because if you don't have hope, then you're going to start to backpedal on any of your efforts. And oftentimes we see this, switching. Switch to another addiction. It doesn't necessarily have to be that I switch to alcohol or drugs. I can start spending way more time at work. I can start spending more time in fantasy football. I can start spending a little extra money at the store and do a little more shopping. I can play a little more video games. I can do any number of things, diverting all that energy that I historically was putting into pornography and sexual activity and rerouting it into something else that's not any more productive for me. It's just harnessing that energy. And so we certainly don't want to be naive to the fact that there are cross addictions, or what we call addiction interaction, multiple addictions happening at the same time. So it does us no good to assume that you're just dealing with a sexual addiction or a pornography addiction. We have to be holistic and assume that there might be other things, and we're going to explore. We're going to be really discerning about that. Obviously, I'm going to promote this piece. I am an individual therapist. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I see the great value and benefit in it. But let me be very clear. I see my job as a therapist is to work myself out of a job as a therapist with you and into connection with other people in your lives. Now, I can't say how long that's going to take for any one person, but I'm clear with you on the front end. I'm not desirous to have a permanent relationship with you as your therapist. I don't necessarily want to see you for 10 years, 20 years, but I'll see you as long as it takes and as long as you're invested. And I certainly won't ever work harder for you than you work for yourself. I will not collude with that part of the process. However, individual therapy I've found to be very, very critical in the early stages of recovery. Why? Well, you got to have somebody that has a sense of what's going on here. You got to find somebody that's trained in dealing with sexual or relational dysfunctions. And there's different organizations that do that. I'm certified through the ITAP organization. That's the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. We're known as CSATs. But there's other organizations such as SASH, even LifeStar, if you can see them out here. LifeStar is another organization that promotes really great training for therapists around sexual matters. But just because they have that training doesn't mean they're going to be a great therapist for you. They've got the training, that's great. Now, you got to go do some interviewing. You got to figure out if they're going to hold your feet to the fire, if they're going to be soft on you, if they're going to be firm with you. Firm does not mean angry and aggressive. Firm means I'm going to hold you accountable. I'm going to expect of you what I know you're capable of. And I'm not going to tolerate less than that. I'm going to be disappointed when you don't follow through on things. And I'm going to let you know it. But I'm also going to be a shoulder to cry on when you need it, when you've made mistakes, but you're heartfelt in your effort to recover from it. So a good therapist for the person for the person who's struggling from recovery needs to be somebody that's going to be knowledgeable, but that will confront you about that behavior. They've got to be competent in those two domains. Anybody that just kind of maneuvers softly or slowly through it, or is reticent, even though they got the training, may not be what you're looking for. Now, at the end of the day, that may be exactly what you're looking for. You've got to figure it out. But at the end of the day, if they're not confronting you, and they're not probing, and they're just trusting you at your word, that's not going to be safe for you. That's a waste of money and a waste of time and resources. And ultimately, it becomes a disruption to your belief in therapy down the road when you may be in a more motivated stance to do something. Now, what do we do when we get in there? Myself, after we have that sexual health conversation, we jump right into it. We do a full sexual and relational history from birth to where them sitting in that office with me right there. And it's very detailed, very specific. We don't hold anything back. I need to know exactly all the experiences you've been exposed to, been involved with, starting from what you observed from your parents. What did they do in their relationship? Were they affectionate? Were they loving to one another? Did they show open affection to you as a kid? How did they treat the children? How did the siblings get along? When did you first notice your own genitals? When did you start noticing somebody of the opposite or same sex, whatever your attraction may be? When did you start feeling anything? When did you start discovering that you had arousals? When did you first masturbate? When was your first exposure to pornography? When was your first kiss? Everything on the table. To date, I have not met anybody that has actually been fully aware of their own sexual and relational history until after we've finished it with them. Oftentimes, they're so surprised by all the different things that come into play that influence their own sexual development. It's big part of it is just to educate them on their own experiences. The other piece is to educate me so that I can start looking at certain benchmark moments or experiences that may have significant meaning or impact for them that they haven't considered. But it's also to start taking away the shame, because if you can't speak your story, you can't heal from your story. And we're going to talk more about that when we start doing any kind of group work. We also start looking through what's known as a genogram. It's a family tree, if you will, but it's not just looking at who are all the people, but what are the relationship dynamics? What kind of attachments or failed attachments are there on any different generation? Not just you with them, but different people along the way. Are there other addictions in the family, not just sexual in nature? Has there been trauma? Has there been abuse? We know that in fact, there was a recent study just came out. In fact, I was reading about it from a colleague this week that Jews from the Holocaust, they've looked at the generations since, and there is literally a generational transmission of the trauma on a cellular level. They're literally carrying the trauma in the second and third generations. And so if we know that that's possible for Jews from a Holocaust camp, then we know it's just possible for anybody from any source of trauma. If there's been significant abuse or abandonment or violence or aggression or sexual hostility in a family system, that stuff's getting passed down. We can't ignore that. That's not neutral. That's very malignant. And so then it transitions pretty naturally into what we call a trauma egg. Just a big old egg. We get a big old huge piece of newsprint paper. We draw a big fat egg on it. And we start listing off the different experiences throughout their life that had any kind of a traumatic component to it. And trauma is not just all these really huge, negative, bad things that happen that are so obvious, like I was sexually molested at 10 by my uncle. Well, that would qualify, but those are the obvious ones. It's anytime there was significant pain, loss, abandonment, fear, loneliness, isolation, anxiety, depression, on and on. When there's a significant amount of that in those early formative years, that's a form of trauma. It may not always equate to big T, but even little t, projected over a period of time, is as or more impactful on an individual than perhaps even a singular episode of sexual molestation. Because that's the overt one that's noticed and can be addressed and typically has some kind of reaction to it, whereas the other ones go unaddressed and unattended, and they start spawning. So we want to pay real close attention to those experiences, but it's not so much what happened. We want to get down to what were the feelings you experienced at the time, what was it that you actually needed, and most importantly, what was the message you took away from that? What did you walk away from that experience believing about men, about women, about yourself, about family, about life, about relationships, about whatever? What was the message? Because that message then becomes a part of your permanent narrative that guides your expectations and reactions. This is important. I cannot say this enough. Group, you see right there the asterisk? Group is the preferred method of treatment for most addictive behaviors, including pornography and sexual addiction. Group. Whether it's 12-step, whether it's a therapist-led, it's important that that be a part of the process. If it's not, you're missing a critical part of recovery, because recovery requires accountability, and that requires having consultation with other people, as we talked about before. People that have been down that similar road, somebody that's got a little more recovery than you, it's really critical that you have connection with them. You're going to find them in these meetings. You're also going to find people that keep relapsing. You're going to find people that are newer to recovery than you are. You're going to find a whole spectrum of them. That's not a problem, that's an opportunity. And these are the places that you're going to find them: SA, SAA, SLAA, SCA, SCRA. There's even faith-based ones. In fact, in my church, in the LDS church, they have an ARP program, addiction recovery program. They have Celebrate Recovery in the mainstream Christian culture. They have different faith-based recovery programs as well. Be a part of something, because if you're not, you will not get the kind of structured recovery from an accountability perspective that you're going to need. This has to be an ongoing deal. As I said, I'm going to work myself out of a job with you, and you're going to stay in a permanent relationship with the folks that you connect with in those meetings. Take you through. It doesn't cost you, and you'll cover as much and more and have a deeper impact. But being able to tell your story with a group of safe peers is critical to assaulting the shame that keeps you locked in the cycle. Shame is the fuel for any and all sexual addiction behaviors. Finding a sponsor, accountability partners, this is what we're talking about here. But it cannot be, please, notice that bottom asterisk. Your spouse, your partner, is not your accountability partner. That's not to say you don't have a responsibility to be accountable for what you've done to them. What I'm referring to is they are not the person you go to first when you make a mistake, when you have a slip. They're the person you go to after you've gone to your support group, gotten accountable to them, got back in line with a plan for what I'm going to do to address this and get back on track, so that I'm showing up to my partner not to traumatize them with, hey, just so you know, I was up all night looking at pornography, and in fact, I connected with a 17, maybe 16-year-old online last night. I just need to let you know in case something happens. That's not going to be okay for the partner. What I've got to do is go to my sponsor and my accountability peers and say, oh my gosh, I don't know what happened. I went off the rails last night. Here's what I had. I'm scared to tell my wife. I'm scared to tell my husband. Whatever it is, I'm going to download with them. I'm going to get to a meeting that day. Or I'm going to meet with them in person. We're going to come up with a plan again. We're going to recalibrate. I'm going to call my therapist and say, I need to get in soon. I got to get back in. Something happened that I was not being aware of. I wasn't being mindful, but I got to get back on track. But within 48 to 72 hours, 2 to 3 days, is a fair amount of time to be able to come back to my partner and say, hey, I had a slip. And here's what I've done since then to address it. So that they aren't there sitting in their own trauma, but then going into caretaking mode. Well, did you do this? Did you do that? What have you done? Their job is not to fix you or correct you. Their job is to feel pain in that moment. Their job is to be allowed to be disrupted without being distracted to try to have to help you. They need the freedom to hurt, be angry, go seek out their support, rather than trying to take care of you in that moment or perceiving that you won't do it and that they have to take charge of the moment. That becomes more of the getting them caught up in the drama, and it makes it more about you than it does about their own need to heal. So please, get the accountability from someone else, but be accountable too when you slip or when you need to check in with your partner after you've taken care of with support, in consultation. These are some obvious things, it would seem, but it doesn't hurt to remind us. Obviously, in the early stages of recovery, we need to discard any and all physical material, delete images or apps or history, what have you. Anything associated with my infidelity, my acting out, my pornography, whatever the behavior is, I need to start getting rid of all of that stuff. But please, as it says in the middle, don't do that by yourself. The doing it by yourself is only a setup to getting right back in line and looking at it and getting triggered by it and getting aroused and acting out and slipping or relapsing. You've got to do it with an accountability partner or partners. So if I'm going to go back into a domain where I've got to clean off this stuff from my computer or my phone or this and that, I need somebody there with me so that I'm not getting triggered without support and there's not an opportunity for me to act out in that moment or shortly thereafter. And we have a plan that I'm going to bookend it. We're going to check in now, and when it's done, I'm going to check in with you tonight. I'm going to check in tomorrow after I've cleaned this off, because I'm also going to start having sometimes buyer's remorse. Oh, I don't know if I really should have gotten rid of that app, because what if my wife or husband leaves me and there was a really good connection I had on that? All these negotiations we start making with ourselves, we call it private deal making. I need accountability. I need somebody to get in that head with me who knows my story, knows my tendencies, to start walking me off the ledge. Obviously, stay away from gray area activities, anything that could be slippery, that's debatable, whether it's healthy or not. And certainly situate any technology that you use at home in a way that others would be able to see it when I'm using it. It makes no sense if I'm in recovery to have any technology that I use in private, which really just feels like secrecy to my partner or my family or other loved ones. I now have deferred away from my ability to use that, at least for a period of my life, to have private time with technology. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be breathing over my shoulder. I literally need to just show them that I'm taking my recovery seriously, and I'm going to have any and all opportunities with my technology out in the open. I got nothing to hide. I'm not going to keep it secret from you, because the doing it otherwise sends a really unhealthy message, even if I'm not looking at anything inappropriate or doing anything inappropriate. I'm not sending the message that I'm taking my recovery seriously, and I'm certainly not taking seriously to you that I'm empathetic to what it might be like for you to watch me go off somewhere else or know I'm somewhere using the technology, and you're not able to know what's going on. But we got to be clear, I'm not inviting the spouse or partner to micromanage, to police, because once again, that just pulls you right back into the system and keeps you sick, so to speak. You're not sick, but it makes the situation unhealthy. And it keeps us looking and focusing on the things that are away from what's recovery focused. And absolutely, display inspirational photos. Anything that's going to help remind me of what matters to me. Is your hand up?
Yeah.
Yep.
You talk about the spouse not being the police. What about parents or youth?
Parents for youth. Okay, so parents monitoring their children if they're doing behaviors and so forth. Yeah. Well, that's a little different because a parent and a child, that's a very different situation because we're talking about adults up here. The child does need accountability and responsibility, and the child is relying upon the parents' developed gray matter, as we were talking about before, to guide and police them. Now, it doesn't mean the kid's going to love me micromanaging some things, but it's called privileges. You don't have a right to have access to technology without this. This is mine that I'm letting you use, and here are the guidelines for using it. So when it comes to a parent and a child, absolutely I have a lot of say in that. It doesn't mean they don't get to at least petition their thoughts and feelings about it. We can have a negotiation, but ultimately mom and dad get the final say on what's going to make sense to them. Oftentimes, and what really helps here, and we're going to talk a little more about couples therapy, but family therapy, or parents getting their own therapy at the same time as a kid that may be struggling with that, getting guidance from a clinician who can say, hey, here's how to go about that specific situation, because I can't speak always specifically, it's more general in this moment, but a good clinician will guide a parent or a spouse in what's a healthy response, what's an unhealthy, what may be excessive, what may be unexcessive. And again, we're not there to please the child or please the partner, we're there to take care of ourselves. We're there to make sure that we're doing what's in our best interest health-wise, but also if it's a child, what's in their best interest, because they won't know. But that's a great question.
You're talking for an accountability partner, though.
Right, for an accountability partner, you can still have a parent, but oftentimes the kid isn't necessarily in that kind of a relationship with their parent, and so sometimes it can become an uncle or a pastor or a bishop or somebody who's in some way older, not some other 10-year-old who's going to be their accountability partner. But we also are encouraging kids younger and younger to start having sexual health, healthy sexual conversations. But that's a whole other conversation we can get into and how to go about doing that. So absolutely, when it comes to accountability, not the spouse, parents can do that, but we've got to be clear that they may not be giving us all that. We've got to let them know that it's safe to have somebody else to talk to, and that I'm not going to probe what you say to them, but I am going to be curious about what's the tone and tenor of your health, and they have a responsibility to come to me if they're concerned that what you're doing is detrimental, and that we can break confidences with kids around that.
I was going to ask, what about accountability with people in your life that are like your siblings or your brothers and your sisters or maybe your mother, your father, people like that?
I'm not opposed to it, I just don't encourage it. Okay? I'm not opposed to you having siblings or parents be accountability partners. But what I've often experienced is if they're exclusively your accountability partners, then you're probably getting a bit of a biased perspective, and there's a little more of an emotional investment and perhaps an enmeshment. And so if you're going to have them, that's fine, but you certainly need to have another set of accountability peers that are not related to you that can give you an alternative perspective to perhaps what's happening with your family. Not that they don't have your best interest at heart, they just may not give you the best counsel at times. Good. That's a great question, actually. Other help, if you live in rural areas, be aware that there are resources. Obviously, they're of limited use at times, but there's online support groups, recovery events such as this you guys are coming to, workshops, etc. There's remote counseling. In fact, there's some therapists that do Skype or teletherapy, as it's called. In our state, the rules are that I could not do Skype with a person who's in another state unless I had a license in that state as well. So even though the potential to offer help is there, there's restrictions and limitations. So I could Skype somebody here in the state of Arizona, but I couldn't do it with somebody outside of that. So wherever we're at, we have to be sure that whatever the laws are in that state, that we're not encouraging a therapist to compromise an ethical boundary that could come back and backfire, okay? I have to have that conversation all the time with folks that come from out of town that say, okay, so can we do this more when I get back to Mississippi, when I get back to New York? Sorry, I can't. That's why you need to have your own therapist at home that you're already working with when you come here to do some intensive work. There's recovery apps that you can look at, recovery literature, self-help books. In fact, there's a really good book that came out this year by Rob Weiss and Jennifer Schneider called Always Turned On. It's literally the most current and up-to-date book on sexual addiction and pornography addiction in the digital age. I would encourage that. In the back of that book, it has a lot of resources for the spouses, the partner, the family members, as well as the addict himself. Rob Weiss and Jennifer Schneider. Couples therapy. If you have a relationship, whether it's marital or just committed, and you're dealing with sexual or pornography addiction, couples therapy is critical. In fact, this is more of a shift. Historically, in the recovery field, in sex addiction anyway, they would try to postpone couples therapy and just put a lot of work initially with the addict. We've come to realize that was a big mistake. That's a big mistake because he or she may be doing good work in recovery, but they're still coming home to their partner or spouse who may or may not be getting their own help And we're certainly not giving them any guidance on how to address the things that are actually organically coming up in their relationship that may or may not even be directly related to the acting out, but even simple things as finances, dishes, raising kids becomes an ordeal because of the hurt, the trauma, and the betrayal. And if we're not guiding them through some of those critical, necessary life experiences during the early stages of recovery, we're doing an injustice. So couples therapy is critical. But at the same time, couples therapy is important for us to create a forum for you to have healthy therapeutic disclosure. Being able to give them the understanding of what I've done up to this point and a platform from which to share going forward. So we're not necessarily encouraging people the first time in couples therapy to disclose everything that's happened, but we're certainly gearing them up for that opportunity. Now, we don't force the clients to say or to hear it, but we strongly, strongly, strongly recommend it. It's a part of the healing deal. If I don't get answers around necessary questions, even if I don't think they're necessary, then they become these latent, almost like tumors that start to grow, metastasize, and becomes a problem later on. It starts to flavor our reactions and our expectations without even knowing it. So disclosure is a critical thing, but in a therapeutic setting, both partners having support up to that point, during it, and post it. So when we do therapeutic disclosure with our clients, we already have individual sessions lined up the very next hour and over the next few days to process the fallout, the feelings, the emotional overwhelm of a disclosure, because we're talking about some really, really painful stuff. I've yet to do a disclosure, and I've done well over 100 of them, where both parties were not in pain as a result of it and not sure how to go forward. And so it's all about gearing them up for that and then walking them through the recovery after the disclosure, because the disclosure in and of itself becomes its own trauma for both partners. Even though for the person who's sharing it, there's a measure of relief that I no longer have secrets, and now there's the pain of, I no longer have secrets. You know. And then the other person now is carrying the weight of that. And what I've known all along and have had years to come to terms with as the addict, he or she has just been dumped on, and all the past is present for them. So imagine how long it took me to come to terms with and to wrestle with my own sexual behaviors. You're now expected to deal with it in this moment. No, that's not how it works. And so absolutely the partner has their own individual therapist that they're working with, building up to that intensive moment of disclosure, and then working with them afterwards. Has to be fair, has to be safe, and it has to be just. Sexual sobriety. What time are we at? Anybody got the time? 42. Oh, shoot, we got to hurry up. All right. Sexual sobriety. We got to create a bottom line definition of the behaviors that I'm going to stop. Okay? I've got to get clear. That's why we did that sexual history. They often come in thinking that maybe just looking at porn or maybe hooking up with escorts is the only thing that they've got to stop. Sorry, that's not it. We've got to be really clear about all the different behaviors, sexual or otherwise, that are feeding the addiction, that I've got to have a definition of that is out of bounds. That's out of bounds behavior, red light behavior, if you will. And it's critical in the early stages to have a total sobriety period, abstinence from any form of sexuality. The idea of sexual healing is not like with alcoholism, to stop drinking alcohol ever again. That works in alcohol. It would be like saying to somebody who has an eating disorder, stop eating, you'll never have any more problems with food addiction. That's not an answer. This is a process addiction. Food consumption and sex is a part of our biological makeup, so we're not expecting people to go sexless the rest of their life. But we are inviting you to take a time out from it, a fast, if you will, 30, usually up to 90 days, to help reestablish a sobriety period, but also to start coming to terms with things like what is healthy and unhealthy sexual behavior. My brain doesn't know the difference. I can look at pornography and masturbate to it, or I can make love to my wife. It doesn't know the difference. It just knows arousal. And my brain needs to come to terms with what's healthy and unhealthy and taking a complete time out from it. That means not even touching myself, doing anything to arouse my sexual self. And then I start learning to, wait a minute, now that I'm not doing that, what am I going to do to take care of myself when I start feeling overwhelmed, distress, anxiety, whatever the case may be? Sex or pornography or masturbation or whatever has become my coping strategy. I start to come to terms with, wait a minute, that's what I've been doing. What do I do now? Well, that's what therapy is doing at that point. That's what the accountability group is, helping us to come to terms with what are some alternative strategies that move us away from intensity, which is what the addiction does, and move us over to intimacy, which is the connection. And connection and intimacy will never have the same euphoric hit as the intense acting out. And that's a part of the recovery process that the addict has to grieve. I'm not going to have the intensity. But when I work through it, I'm going to have passion. And intensity and passion are not synonymous. We start to look at the past dependency upon it. We start to detox. Building awareness, yep, covered that. So there's a lot of things that we need to be aware of, that when we start to take care of ourselves, we got to start making sense of this has been an intensity-focused and a distraction-oriented behavior. I need to notice all the habits of using fantasies and behaviors that avoid the internal discomfort and emptiness. That's either been the precursor to my acting out or become the byproduct, or both. Moving towards self-care means I'm going to learn how to do nothing for periods of time. Then start to establish other interests and hobbies. Addicts struggle to not do anything. They've got to do something. The idea of just being present, being calm, being still is foreign. It's scary oftentimes. So I got to learn to meditate or pray or find some kind of practice, whether it's Tai Chi or Qigong, or there's various ways that I can get in touch with my mind and my body and my spirit to slow me down. Spirituality is a huge part of recovery. It's woven into the 12 steps. Why? Because we understand that there's got to be something greater than ourselves that's tying us back into the purpose and meaning of our sexual self and our relational self. Cultivating healthy friendships, both in and outside of the recovery community. Far too often we start getting in contact with individuals who think that their whole life now has to become recovery, and I only hang out with recovery people. Not true. In fact, I would say that's not a great idea. You become really one-dimensional. You got to have a balance of both, but people in the other community that you're dealing with that aren't recovery-oriented have to appreciate the things that are not going to be appropriate for you, things that I cannot indulge in. Just like I may have friends who drink but aren't alcoholics, and I'm a recovering alcoholic, they certainly need to be understanding that they're not going to invite me to the bar with them, but I can still hang out with them. We can go watch the game. We can do different things. They have to have a healthy respect for my struggle. Basic stuff like physical fitness, sleep, and diet, critical. In fact, sleep is one of the most underrated and most underdeveloped parts of a recovery process. If we are not getting 7-8 hours of sleep every night, we're killing our capacity to sustain our endurance and our energy. And our culture is replete with poor sleep, so this is something that we could spend a long time talking about. Establishing boundaries, improving your home, maintaining it, spending time in nature. Hey, get a pet. You may not like animals, but it's an opportunity to start putting your focus on another living thing outside of yourself, developing that skill of being other-centered versus self-centered. I got to do check-ins with myself, the social life. Here's the sexual boundary plan. I know we're running out of time, but I want to highlight this. Inner, middle, outer. You got to work on this with not by yourself, not with your spouse or partner. This is with your recovery team, your therapist, your sponsor, your accountability peers. That does not mean your partner or your spouse cannot read it, can't see it. Of course they can. And in fact, they're allowed to give you comments on it, but they certainly are not the ones that should be deciding for you what goes in it and what doesn't. We can speak more about that, but the inner boundary is a bottom line definition of sexual sobriety. I am sexually sober when I am doing da-da-da, and when I am not doing da-da-da, and being very specific about that. Middle boundary are the warning signs, the slippery situations that can lead to going back into acting out. In fact, I spend most of my time with clients on that part because they usually can get pretty clear pretty quick about the actual behaviors that they need to stop doing. It's what I need to be mindful of that could be the induction into the acting out. There's certain people that I need to be aware of, certain interactions, certain emotions, certain conversations, certain dynamics. That stuff I've taken hours with clients to flesh that out so they become really clear. Oh my gosh, that is a setup, that is a setup, that is a setup. And it's not that they have to avoid those situations, that they need to move into what's called the outer boundary. They need to have a response to that middle area. We call it red, yellow, green, like a stoplight. Red, yellow, green. The green is what I do to counteract the yellow so I don't drop into the red. It doesn't mean I have to eliminate certain people all the times, or I can't have a feeling of shame or anger, but I have to know what I'm going to do as a response. So it's a healthy combination of work, play, recovery that's used to replace the intensity of acting out. But again, it has to be somebody other than my spouse that's doing it. And I cannot change it or alter it without going back to that community, that support team, that therapist, that sponsor. Because if I start making private deals with myself in my recovery, it's no different than when I was making private deals with myself in my acting out. I'm living in consultation. Recovery is living in consultation at all costs, taking the risk. I think we're pretty close to time. There's other stuff we could talk about. Let me wrap up with gifts of healing. Fosters a rediscovery of self, increased involvement with loved ones, your creative self, healthy recreation, deeper understanding of my emotional needs. Acting out with pornography and sexuality erodes over time and quickly at times my capacity to know what I need and how to get it met in a healthy way. It becomes my default mechanism for dealing with anything. Become more vulnerable and intimate in my relationships. Self-esteem kicks in. My desire to be honest and integrable starts to move in the direction that it needs to, and a deeper level of maturity for loving relationships. We've got to be able to be rigorously honest to heal the broken trust. We could spend a lot of time. There was a couple other presentations today that are talking about that, so I won't go too much into this, but in order to heal, I have to risk being honest. Risk hurting my partner with the truth. It is like a common refrain in my office that I could never tell him that. That would just hurt her or him too much. And I say, hogwash. It will hurt them. And who are you to decide what they can or can't handle and what they should or shouldn't know when they're in a committed relationship with you, expecting that you're going to give them what they need to know to make informed decisions for themselves. So don't presume to know what your partner can or can't handle. Let's assume they're stronger than you give them credit for, and let's recognize you're really just covering your own butt. You're really just avoiding your own accountability and responsibility in getting well. They know it. They oftentimes just need somebody that's going to hold them accountable. It's not a form of disrespect to shoot somebody straight. It's the absolute opposite. It's a full measure of respect to say, no, I'm not going to let you buy into that myth that you're telling yourself, because it isn't true and is never bared out in my office and my work with my clients. We'll wrap up with a thing that we started off with. In order for us to really do recovery, we've got to know that the antidote to addiction is connection. Connection with ourselves, connection with a higher being, connection with other loved ones. And it's only achieved through recovery. And recovery comes in many shapes and forms. I've shared with you the ones that have worked for us, or sex addiction we're trying to run towards and embrace intimacy and connection. The very opposite of what the addiction has been doing for us. Thank you.